Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Philip Yun, and I am the CEO of World Affairs. Wanted to thank you all for joining our remote programming. I'm here in San Francisco. The title of the program is Collapse of American Diplomacy. I wanted to be sure to mention that this program of World Affairs is done in partnership with the Pacific Council on International Policy, and I wanted to welcome all of those members for joining us. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce author and former diplomat Elizabeth Shackelford, who is here with us. You're in New Hampshire, right, Elizabeth?
Vermont.
Vermont, okay, Vermont,
Yeah.
excuse me. And so for many of you, may recognize her name most prominently, probably from her 2017 resignation letter to then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in 2017. That went viral. And then since then, she's been doing an amazing job of continuing to raise awareness about the state of the State Department. And as part of that process, she's just authored this book. Usually I have a copy of it. I don't. I have an electronic version of this. There we go. Thank you. We have Elizabeth is the author of that book, the Dissent channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age. And I, of course, had the chance to read it. Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Having been at the State Department myself, there are a lot of things that I recognized. And we will talk about that. So as a big picture, the book chronicles your experiences as a Foreign Service officer, career Foreign Service officer, starting in the South of Sudan. And then it goes into the Civil War, in which you actually experienced. You were in the middle of all that, which is very harrowing. And then it takes you to Washington, D.C., where you then wrote a dissent part of and organized a dissent cable, which we will talk about in a few moments. And then again, eventually to your resignation from the State Department. And so as I thought and read the book, and as we talked about, there seem to be some major themes. One was the democratization of diplomacy, accountability, the demise of American diplomacy, and the ability to make change. And so I wanted to structure our conversation in the next 45 minutes to go along those lines, just to let our listeners know. But I thought it would be really important to just start with some context for you. And so let's start out with the first question, a couple questions like, what is the Dissent channel? So you can let people know what that means. This is the title of the book.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the Dissent channel is a pretty well-known official tool in the U.S. State Department. It was developed back during the Vietnam War era, specifically to provide an opportunity for people inside the State Department, civil service and foreign service, to be able to officially challenge U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy. It was really a reaction to the highest levels of dissent that we'd seen in the State Department throughout and the Foreign Service throughout its history, because a lot of people were frustrated with what the U.S. government was doing in Vietnam and the countries in the region. So it was started out as a really great idea to have this official tool where if you felt as though your voice wasn't being heard and you had tried every other element in your chain of command, you could, as a Foreign Service officer or civil service personnel, file an official dissent cable or memo, depending on where you are. And the dissents are intended to go to a very high level circulation. They're meant to basically make it to the desk of the Secretary of State and other high-level people, at the top of the relevant bureau, regional bureau, and elsewhere. Now, in practice, and they are required under regulations to send back a formal response to that dissent. In practice, it's probably a lot less glamorous than it sounds, because realistically, we push a lot of paper, as Philip knows, at the State Department, so it does become kind of part of that paper universe. But it's put into a very, very narrow channel, and realistically, in South Sudan at the time, I was mid-level officer. I guess you can't really realistically expect I'm going to write a paper that's going to go up to the 7th floor where the secretary is and suddenly shift all of our policy. But it does require someone at a high level to read it, acknowledge it, and send back an official response. So that's essentially what it is. And over time, it's utility has really shifted. I think it was a lot more popular in its earlier days. And frankly, now it's quite hard to find examples of it, and it's a pretty rarely used tool.
And so just pull on that, why do you think it's a rarely used tool right now? Is it like irrelevant in certain ways, do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of respect for the idea inside the State Department, but the culture of the State Department really doesn't, it doesn't promote a lot of challenge. Um, you look at kind of the pathways of how people get promoted, how people move up through the system, and it really is a fairly staid bureaucracy. So you know, part of it is just the culture. Part of it is the idea that if you want to be looked on as a really effective officer, um, you tend to have a better reputation if you smooth things over than rather if you rock the boat. So part of it is that idea. There's this sense, as Philip, I'm sure you're aware, in the State Department, of your corridor reputation.
Right.
Everything is made by your corridor reputation is what you're based on. It's just your reputation, but it's your reputation in the halls of the State Department. And if you say bid on a position in a certain country, and someone who doesn't like you knows someone in that particular embassy or consulate, the idea of the corridor reputation is that bad things you've done will follow you there, and will ruin your career. So there seems to be a sense that if you rock the boat too much, that it will affect that, and you know, in doing so, it'll affect your career. So I think that's part of it.
So yeah, when I was there, it was called hall reputation, and because the halls in the State Department are endless, right? So, you know, I look at your book as really, in certain ways, your evolution as to who you are right now. It's a very interesting story, and you clearly had some ideas about what the Foreign Service was when you first started. We got young listeners here as well. So tell us about, you know, how did you come to join the Foreign Service, and how did you decide to become a diplomat? And then that sort of starts the story for where we'll go moving on there. And how did you end up in South Sudan too? I think that's another thing.
So I found out about just the basic concept of the Foreign Service and diplomacy probably a lot later than people, particularly, you know, in an area like, you know, the Bay Area, or places where you have a lot of international activity. I was born and raised in Mississippi. So, you know, I didn't know anybody in my circle or my parents' circle who was involved in diplomacy or the federal government. So I learned about, you know, first learned even the term the Foreign Service when I was a law student and did an internship in Kosovo, working on rule of law work with the USAID program. And that was my first experience meeting US diplomats. I met a group of, actually it was a group of guys, they were all on their first tour because it was an unaccompanied tour back in, gosh, what year that was. I won't age myself, it was a while ago. And I was fascinated by this idea that these were these folks who just kind of come out of orientation at the Foreign Service, and they were in this interesting place doing fascinating work. I still remember actually Dave Holmes, who some of you might recognize that name because he was one of the ones who testified in the impeachment trials last fall. He was the first diplomat that I met. I met him when he was on his first tour in Kosovo as a political officer, and it just seemed fascinating to me. But it took me a number of years before I decided to actually apply for the Foreign Service. So I came in a little bit later than other people do. And I came in with that completely, you know, idealistic, naive idea that I was just going to go bring American greatness to the world. And as Philip knows, having read the book now, I get that that naivete gets dashed pretty quickly. But the idea that I was drawn to the Foreign Service by, and that still, you know, still gives me a sense of pride with that job, is the sense of service, you know, to the country in the name of a more stable and prosperous world. So that was really what drove it. And specific to South Sudan, which I had hoped would have been I wanted that to be my first tour. That was where I was just angling for. It was the newest country in the world when I first joined the Foreign Service. Actually, it was only became independent about a year after that. And this idea that the US government was really vested in that independence and in this new nation. I just thought, well, if we can't help this small country with this much assistance, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, what are we gonna? What places can we really help to build a young democracy? So that's what I had in mind when I first arrived in South Sudan.
Okay. With that as context, let's go into some real specifics. and touch upon the themes, the democratization of diplomacy. And essentially for you, it was this sort of for people to need to know what is going on, because Sudan is a very small country. News cycle gets dominated by so many other things. So from the outset of the book, you describe your arrival in country, and then this notion about how the history and the present weren't adding up in certain ways. And so what do you think are the key things that people need to understand that they actually don't?
I feel as though if most Americans had any sense of how much intervention we are doing around the world in the name of the American people, they'd be really shocked. One of the kind of examples that I use is the idea that we have 800 military installations of some form or another across the globe. I mean, it's just really mind-boggling. In terms of South Sudan specifically, there was some, because celebrities were involved in promoting the independence of this country, and a lot of people kind of heard about it in terms of in relation to this this excitement of having a new country, but we had a very shallow picture in the US, even with a place that had a lot of congressional interest, both because the human rights kind of advocacy groups were really interested in the fate of South Sudan, and because there was a large push by the evangelical contingent, and which has a lot of influence in Congress as well. So we had a pretty shallow version of the story, which was, Sudan bad, South Sudan good, Sudan Muslim, South Sudan Christian, and this idea that we've got to help this oppressed southern part of Sudan become independent made it a very good kind of good versus evil story. And when that was the story that I had in my background and in my mind when I first arrived in mid 2013, and it didn't take very long on the ground to realize that the truth of the situation was far more complicated. What we were still lauding back in the United States as the success of this young democracy just didn't play out in reality. It was a place where there was a lot of violence against civilians, there was a lot of social unrest, and it was, of course, on the brink of a very, very brutal civil war upon my arrival. So I found that the stories that the short versions that we tell ourselves back here at home often don't comport with the reality, both in terms of what's happening on the ground and what our role as the United States is. And that's a particular example with South Sudan. We've looked back on it as this great success story of US foreign policy, and that we helped this oppressed area become an independent and democratic state. And the truth is we've actually facilitated a pretty brutal and oppressive government to stay in power and continue to commit abuses.
So just as a reminder for people listening, we have this Q&A channel. So I encourage you, what I'm going to do is try to integrate all these questions as you hear what Elizabeth is talking about. We're going to talk about accountability, democratization of diplomacy, American diplomacy generally, and how you can make an impact. So those are the topics we're covering in the context of South Sudan. So please feel free to just send us some questions, and we'll go ahead and integrate them as we move forward. So the other thing I wanted to, you mentioned that a little bit, so I wanted to be clear. In your mind, in the book, you talk about the deep interest of the US government in South Sudan. And you talk about, what you thought it was and what it is now. Can you talk about what those interests are right now in your mind? And why do we invest so much time and effort in this?
It's really an interesting question, and it was one of the reasons I was so curious about South Sudan at the time. And largely speaking, the U.S. government doesn't prioritize Africa fairly high on its foreign policy list. I mean, Africa is a massive continent with a lot of countries, and it gets a very, very little prime time in the State Department writ large and in the White House. But South Sudan somehow seemed to buck that trend. I mean, again, a very, very small place that got massive humanitarian investment and assistance, military assistance, and a lot of congressional focus. I mean, there were lots of hearings on South Sudan in the lead up to and after independence. A lot of people were paying attention. big part of this is lobbying, and who has influenced lobbying. And as I mentioned, the evangelicals kind of formed bonds with the human rights community in terms of pressing for congressional action. There was some celebrity interest, but one of the reasons that this got so much traction in Washington is because at the time we had a lot of ongoing battles with Sudan. And if Sudan's already somewhat, a country that's been kind of deemed an enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I think that probably made Washington a lot more receptive to, really putting some effort behind what seemed at the time like, putting a thumb in the eye of Khartoum. And, while that did effectively, work out that way, it was a place that we had an interest in so long as it was really suiting our needs. But as it became much, much harder after independence to really accept that, this, to use a phrase that I will steal from a friend, we couldn't quite admit that kind of this baby that was born was not particularly beautiful. The new country was not as perfect and as much of a success as we had wanted to be. So rather than really dive into the complicated factors behind, building accountability for all of the crimes and all of the harm and trauma that had happened during those wars leading up to independence, we kind of just continue it as a country to say that it was a success story. And it seems like throughout the last years of the Obama administration, the issue was primarily to make sure that it didn't just completely fail on that administration's watch. So once it was no longer serving our needs, but it would have been too hard to fix. And I think at that stage, it became too hard to really continue investing in.
Okay, so again, we only have 45 minutes here, so I want to jump and encourage people to read the book, but I just wanted to touch on these different issues to stir the interest for them to purchase it. A big theme for you that you talked about is accountability, and you talk about accountability on two levels. You just mentioned it in your prior answer, and I'll ask you a little bit, after you describe this, about the violence and accountability in that way. So can you talk to me about what you mean by two levels of accountability, and maybe give us examples of where there is a lack of accountability in your mind?
So the two different levels of accountability that I saw while I was in South Sudan, and that are really key in our foreign policy and a real stumbling point. There is the accountability of our foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, which is who or is anyone holding our government to account for the decisions that we make in our foreign policy. And this gets back to that idea of the democratization of foreign policy. Who should be holding our government account? Well, Congress has an oversight role, a very serious oversight role over the executive. Of course, State Department is part of the executive. And who holds Congress to account? That's the American people. So one of the challenges with having an accountable foreign policy is that you have to make the American people care about our foreign policy, because that is what influences Congress to do its oversight role. And at the end of the day, it's really hard to see what what metrics we're using to judge the success of things like our foreign policy in Africa. So that's the lack of accountability of our foreign policy. Then there is the lack of accountability that we put on the governments that we have influence over. And in the South Sudan example, it was really specifically about the bad acts of this administration that we helped put into power, and then we helped keep in power through our continued legitimizing of that administration and continuing to pour money and support into it, including into ministries that were helping to perpetuate the war, like the Ministry of Oil, Ministry of Finance. So very specifically, we had this level of influence, but we were not willing to use it too hard to press that country's leadership to do better. Ahead of the Civil War, there was a lot of violence happening and being committed by the security services in areas like Jonglei State, where there was a significant amount of violence between ethnic groups, some of whom were armed by the government, and also between the military and different ethnic groups of civilians. And we would wag our finger, but we wouldn't stop our support or really threaten to really stop our support. So that's the level of accountability that we should have been influencing at the time there.
So, you do talk about how you were disappointed the US government didn't stop the level of violence. So that means in your mind, there was the ability to do that. I mean, was it really as you know, there got to be other things than just say, we're not going to give you any more money, but he didn't really threaten that. So is that what it would entail, where you think they should have done?
I always come back to the idea of, with diplomacy, as with everything else, first, do no harm. That should be our principle. There's a question of, could we have stopped all the violence? No. Could we have mitigated the violence? I do strongly believe that there are concrete things we could have done, particularly after the war began. We could have stopped providing training and assistance to the military. We could have, which we did ultimately do, but we did not do right away. We could have supported an arms embargo that many countries were calling for, and that would have reduced the weapons that they could have used against their own people. But we didn't choose to make those decisions. So, could we have stopped the war entirely? Probably not. But at the same time, there's a level of complicity that you have in these activities if you are helping to empower the ones who are doing it. At the end of the day, it at very least would have been better if we had said, we're not going to support a government that does that to its own people. So we'll continue doing humanitarian support, but we're going to put up these other obstacles rather than continue to facilitate that government staying in a position of power and abuse.
So in terms of the accountability, again, one of the things that you talk about is short-term gains versus strategic interests. There's always this disconnect sometimes if you don't watch out what's happening on the ground to what's actually getting back to the center. And the art of it is integrating them together so they actually are quite effective. And in the case of Sudan, in your mind, it wasn't done as well as it could or should have been. So can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe it's, it's a really good lesson in terms of managing large bureaucracies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to be realistic when we think about the best case scenario. I mean, the best case scenario with everybody, making really sound decisions, you're still going to have a disconnect between Washington and the field in terms of timing and lag and how you interpret things on the ground. But I think that one of the challenges that we've had is increasingly just expanding the influence of political appointees and political players throughout both the State Department and the National Security Council and the White House. And I think that does tend to enhance the short-term view. Necessarily a lot of political appointees, particularly kind of in an early kind of first 4-year term of an administration, are going to have a shorter-term view, which is, what can I do in this period of time that I'm guaranteed? That's a different point of view than you have, for example, from careerists, whether they're in Washington or in the field. And I think that how politicized our foreign policy has become really does tend to make it a much more short-term rather than kind of long-term and strategic approach. Having some kind of limitation on, kind of how deep down in the State Department we put political appointees, I think is one way that we could try and manage to ensure that you do have, when messages are coming back from the field to Washington, you're not immediately hitting someone who's only been working on, in this area for 2 years and might be looking at it for another, election cycle, which happens more rapidly every time. So that's one example.
Okay. So let's talk about the demise of American diplomacy. You write in the book, we've heard, and as you say, it's not really new. I mean, there's always this constant pull about the lack of resources. It was, in my time, the lack of resources that are at the State Department compared to DOD. I mean, everyone in their mind thinks the State Department and foreign assistance is a major part of our foreign policy, and it's like a small 2 or 3%, if that, of our disposable GDP, right? And the budget. And in many minds, you're making an argument about ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure. And so, talk to me about what you have seen over your time and why you're calling the alarm to that. I mean, there are a number of questions related to that. And once you do this, there's specific questions that I will go to that people are really curious about.
Well, I think it's really important for people to understand that what's happened under this current administration, while it is a more extreme version, I mean, of lots of things, not just the gutting of the State Department, but so many of these problems have been with us, as you've mentioned, for far longer. I mean, the State Department has been in decline and kind of having its resources gutted for decades at this point. A lot of this happened post-Cold War when there was just a focus on, returning to a greater focus on domestic issues, and really making sure that our military had what we believed it needed in that era. And then, of course, you get into the war on terror years, and everything was just being reinforced on the military side. So, not a new issue, but certainly one that has been exacerbated under this current administration. But what that meant to me in practice, I mean, if you're saying, well, what does it cost the American people if we don't have enough money in diplomacy? And we've all heard the, kind of the quote of, if you don't fully fund diplomacy, the military is going to need more bullets. And that is true. But what it also meant is that as a diplomat serving in South Sudan, I frequently had to cancel important engagements because we didn't have enough motor pool cars that were armored to drive me, which meant I'm sitting on this compound watching the cats walk by when I should be at an important meeting discussing the atrocities happening up, in the northern part of the country. It meant that, we didn't get the funding that we needed to reinforce the walls in time before a heavy rain took down the perimeter wall of our residential compound in the middle of a war. I mean, these are concrete issues. And now, the last example I'll give, because again, it's just very, very specific. Our military has an expanding footprint in Somalia, which was the last place that I served before when I resigned. And we had military personnel traveling all across the country. Meanwhile, I'd spent 6 months on the American taxpayer dime learning the Somali language. And I never left the Mogadishu International Airport compound because we didn't have the resources we needed and the authorization that we needed in order to travel around and do the important work of diplomacy. So what you ended up seeing over and over again is, I'd see military colleagues come back into the big airport compound, and they've just happened to run into folks at the presidential palace, and we're chatting about the upcoming elections. And as the political officer, I was like, oh, please don't talk to them about the upcoming elections. Like, we should talk to them about the upcoming elections. And so we just didn't have the resources we needed to be effective. So you could take a tiny fraction of what our military was spending there, and you would have a much more effective version of what we were desperately trying to do.
So is this what you mean when you talk about the militarization of our foreign policy? And where do you think that has come from? Why? I mean, clearly that was just, DOD was awash in money, right? They were the ones that had all this stuff, and you could, God, I wish I could have a little bit of that. So, tell us about this.
It's the militarization of our foreign policy has been such a reinforcing cycle for at least 2 decades now. Much of this did happen in the wake of 9/11 and with our kind of real increase in being out involved in war and in war-torn countries in a level that we really hadn't been before. And it was quite simple. I mean, the Department of Defense had a lot of money. And so when things had to be done, they would look to the State Department and say, okay, maybe this is diplomatic activity, but the military has the money and the ability to rapidly execute that. So we started increasingly relying on the military to do things that really are development and diplomatic tools. Yeah. And these are very different. These are different professions. These are different careers. These are different problem sets, and the experience is not the same. And even if kind of the quality of what was coming out of these initiatives were very similar, which it isn't, seeing activities, public affairs being done by a man in uniform is very different from seeing it be done by a development or diplomatic specialist. So I think that it hasn't only harmed our ability to do effective diplomacy, but it's also really harmed and shifted our image in the world. And I will say, I mean, I've worked with many military colleagues in different countries, and almost to a person, they agree with this. They don't want to be out there having to do diplomatic work. Yeah. They want to do their jobs. Exactly. But it just reinforces itself when they continue to have, when they have the resources, they're the ones who get sent.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. You've got people who really don't want to be doing it, but they're good soldiers. And when they're told to do something, they're going to make it work no matter what. I mean, you and I probably have very similar experiences with the military officers who are just amazing, really, for what they do. Yeah. So many of them are just so great, but they're being asked to do something they were never really trained for.
Absolutely.
So let's then talk about, in your mind, over the period of time, there were a couple questions here about, again, the reputation of the United States, right? So talk to me about, you can do it in the context of Trump, and we'll talk about that the next section about what you can do. And, you took your stand in a couple of ways, and we'll talk about that. But just sort of over the period that you were there about, did you see people look at the United States differently and in a different way over the period that you were there? And maybe how it's accelerated or not accelerated under Trump, since you've overlapped.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have seen it shift. And, I want to be clear that, this isn't the only time that it's happened. We certainly had people change their views of the United States and its role in the world, in the early war on terror years. So it's not as though it's entirely unique, but I do think that it's been at a level we haven't seen, possibly ever, certainly not in a long time. But I saw it, particularly from late 2016 until when I resigned in the end of 2017. The shift was very palpable and visible to me. And what changed the most was that people no longer, our counterparts, whether it was in Somalia or European Union counterparts or UN counterparts or other regional African counterparts, people who had routinely looked to America, whether it's my ambassador in a meeting or if I was there representing, they looked to us first. They wanted to know first, what does America think? What do you think we should do? What do we think, should we be promoting something unified as the international community? How should we be, and what public activities should we be doing to push these particular interests, whether around their elections or whatnot? And that changed so quickly. It only took a couple of months for our position in the room in these different multilateral and bilateral interactions to change. And suddenly it went from there'd be an open discussion, whether it was with the UN body or whatnot, and they go to the American representative first and say, okay, what's your position? And then they just stopped doing that. And they stopped doing that, and I would hear in kind of aside conversations with contacts that whatever we said in that room did not necessarily mean that the Trump administration was behind us, that the White House was behind us, or that even State Department leadership was. So it was just that loss of trust in our ability as the practitioners on the ground to be able to reflect what America wanted to do, or the lack of trust that we would be following through as a nation. So that was the most palpable way that I could tell the difference.
Okay, so let's go. We got about a little under 15 minutes. Let's go to giving voice and ability to make change. And as I said, the story, your book is about how you transformed. So two things which led to, one, you helped organize the Dissent channel, okay, which ruffled some feathers, as you described, probably. You continued, and then you eventually wrote a resignation letter. So I want to take quickly talk about the context for the Dissent channel and why and how you decided to do that.
So it was, in a lot of ways, it was just a sense of desperation. Leaving South Sudan in mid 2014, 6 months into a war was incredibly demoralizing. You pour yourself into these places when you're there, you're working, 24 hours a day. When you're working in the middle of a war zone, it doesn't stop. And seeing at how far things had fallen, I wasn't ready to throw in the towel. I'd continued to push for the positions that I believed in, and nothing had changed. And I got back to Washington and was working, and 6 months later, nothing had changed. And I knew that we had this tool of last resort. And by damn, I was going to use that tool of last resort because it seemed so obvious to me and to other people who'd worked on South Sudan what we should be doing. So that was something that it wasn't a hard decision at the end of the day. It was a labor of love in a lot of ways, but initially it felt very hollow. But one message that I have for people is that doing that at the time and getting in response, as you saw in the book, it was practically like a form letter that came back saying, thank you so much for your dissent. Here are the reasons we disagree with you. Goodbye. It didn't feel very inspiring, but here we are years later, and that experience for me developed this whole other opportunity to voice my concern about our foreign policy and to promote other ideas. So you never know when speaking out might impact something further down the line. So that's kind of my first lesson on that. And then in terms of my resignation, it was another kind of teaching moment for me in terms of, it's funny, people think it was this kind of big grand idea that I had, but Philip, you know how strange the bureaucracy is in the State Department. So I'd finally gotten to this low point, and I decided I had to resign. So I emailed my career development officer in Washington to say, I'm planning to resign. What do I need to do? And he sends me back this checklist, and I'm going down the list. And then you are obliged to write a resignation letter to the Secretary of State.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this wasn't an idea that I had, but I was going to use that opportunity to say exactly how I felt. So I was quite inspired by that little tick in the box that I had to do. And they give you a form letter about it, which I did not follow at all, as you know, if you've read my resignation letter. And once I had written it, I thought, this is an important message, not just for on the inside. So I did decide to share it. I did check all of the internal boxes and submit it in order to get approval to share it. And because I'm an A+ student and I don't like to break the rules. But for me, it was just really remarkable how much of an impact that had, not only on people who were following the State Department, but on colleagues of mine on the inside who were also struggling with their decisions. So it was a lesson to me that my one small voice as a mid-level officer who didn't particularly think I had much special to share really had an impact and helped shape the thinking of a lot of other people. So I was really inspired at that point to look for other opportunities to try and use my voice.
So a couple of questions here. One from Adam. He said, do you know David Rank? I know David. I knew David when he was a junior officer in the East Asia Pacific Bureau on Korea. He was a senior diplomat in Beijing. I guess he was a DCM, right? The Deputy Chief of Mission then, who resigned and pulled out when the US pulled out of the Paris Accords, climate change. Did you know him? And tell us a little bit more. They want to know the kind of support that you got from people as you were leaving.
I didn't know him personally, but I took great comfort in his decision to do that as well. At the time, I had already left, but it was a hard decision to leave because there is such a pride in the service. And I wasn't sure what the reception was going to be. And initially, when I had first decided, a lot of people senior to me, particularly those who had already left, were very critical. They suggested you should really stay and try and change things on the inside. As I got closer to my resignation date, however, and things had changed and gotten worse with the administration and our leadership in the State Department, there was a lot of support. I mean, there were still people who criticize it and think that putting a resignation letter out there in the public is an effort for self-aggrandizement. And that was certainly a concern that I had in doing so. But by and large, the people that I most respect in the State Department came back to say, we don't all want to leave and we all really shouldn't leave, but we really appreciate that you've put out there in public a lot of the concerns that we had. So it was very gratifying for me to get that kind of reception from most of my former colleagues.
So here's another question from Namrata. After your resignation from the State Department and your transition to independent consulting, did you feel more enabled to make the change you wanted to see, or does it feel more limiting? I know what the answer to that's going to be.
It's both. I mean, it is liberating. I mean, I feel like I got my freedom of speech back because you are, very much in a box in the State Department as a mid-level officer. But so that part is really liberating. But at the same time, I remember years ago when I was still in South Sudan and I was deeply frustrated and upset with our policies. I remember talking to a good friend of mine who was with Human Rights Watch, and I said, I don't know if I can stay. I feel like I'm not in a position to voice out publicly what we're doing wrong here. And she said, people like you have to stay on the inside because people like me spend all my time lobbying people like you to care about this stuff. And that stuck with me for years because it is true. You have this level of influence as someone with the US government to be able to, to have opportunities to educate and inform and share your concerns with people who have a lot of influence. But at the same time, it's a very bureaucratic organization, and you have to spend many, many years working your way up if you're a career. So I would say I miss some aspects of my ability to have some influence on the inside, but I am grateful to be able to speak openly now in a variety of different forums that I couldn't before.
Okay, so we have a few more, I have a few more questions, and I think I'm particularly for the younger people here. And let me try to combine the two, and then you can answer them both very quickly. So one has to do with, and again, you did this with our career, our high school program earlier. I'm sure they asked the question, what advice do you have for young people considering a career in foreign affairs or just generally within government based on your experience? And the other thing is, based on your experience speaking truth to power and how comfortable it can be, what advice do you have for people in doing that?
So my answer to both is pretty similar, because the advice that I always give people, particularly young people going into the service, whether it's, in other parts of the federal government or the foreign service, and really this goes for any organization that you work for, is you've always got to maintain your moral compass and your purpose, and always keep that front and center. And know that it's not always the people with the most experience who are the most senior who have all the right answers. So be humble when you're new, ask questions, do your homework, but also trust your instincts. And if things don't seem right, don't be shy about speaking up. I always found ways to do it through people that I trusted the most, and I would work my way up and kind of test things out, particularly when I was new, with people who really understood the context. And that helped give me confidence to start speaking up and pushing back. But I think, I highly recommend for people to go into the foreign service and other parts of the federal government, because we direly need good people, in it, and people who are in it for the service. It's incredibly important. But at the same time, you have to maintain that, know that what you're doing is serving, in our case, the Constitution and the US government and the American people's interests. And when it stops doing that, you have to ask what your options are. Your options are speak up, speak out, be a whistleblower if you need to be, and resign is another option, and speak up publicly. So always know that, you're never trapped, and take advantage of those opportunities when they're needed. And I mean, generally speaking, in terms of speaking truth to power, it's hard, it's intimidating, and probably the most intimidating part for me, and I think this is particularly an issue for a lot of professional women, is this imposter syndrome that we often have, where we don't feel like, well, if somebody else must have thought of this already, so if nobody else higher up or smarter than me has said it, then maybe it doesn't need to be said. The truth is, more people more often than not don't speak up. And so it requires the people who have that in mind to come up with the gumption and the courage to say things, even when it's intimidating, and even when you worry that it might hurt your your reputation or your career. So always have trusted people around you, know who you respect, who's above you, to go to for mentorship, and don't trust your gut, and don't be afraid to speak out.
Okay, great, thank you. So last question, I'll give you a couple minutes to think about it. All right, I'll let you have the last word in our conversation. I'm going to go through this the thing that I'm going to let people know, but the question I want you to think about is, we've spent almost 45 minutes with you. Thank you. What are the two things you want to leave people with? So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about that while I sort of go through what I need to do right now. So again, we're come to the end of the program. Wanted to thank having Elizabeth with us today. Wanted to thank the Pacific Council, International Policy, who's partnered with us. Again, let me say, you can learn more by purchasing Elizabeth's book. Elizabeth, hand up the book, okay? And I think what we're doing here at World Affairs is that, part of her book is about really what we all can do ourselves, right? Empowering ourselves to do something, to stay engaged. This is not a spectator sport, vote. That's really big. What we're trying to do at World Affairs, and I think Pacific Council the same way, is giving people the opportunity not only to listen, but to do. And it's all individual. So one, you can support World Affairs by giving a donation online and continuing for our other webinars that we're going to be doing. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing something on COVID-19, how the global economy will be different after COVID-19. And so, Elizabeth, leave us with the last word in that sense. What should we take away from our conversation? What do you want them to keep in mind?
Well, first off, and you stole it from me, I was going to lead with democracy is not a spectator sport. Okay. Washington cares what we all think. And while we feel like our one individual voice doesn't matter, I can tell you on a very granular level, Calling representatives and senators in Washington actually does make a difference. That's how they learn what the American people care about. And if more Americans cared more about what we were doing overseas in their name, in our name, then we would have a more accountable foreign policy. So continue to stay educated and make your voice heard on that front. And my last point is, if not you, who? It's remarkable how often people think that somebody else is going to stand up and say something. And the question is, if you don't do it, why do you think somebody else is going to? I think a message that we've gotten from a lot of frustrated Black people in America through the last few weeks of protests in this country is that they're tired of being the ones to bear the burden on that particular issue of race in our country. And it might seem like a small thing, but the conversations that I've had, and I feel the same way on a different level on foreign policy, but the conversations I've had with a lot of African-American friends is, what do you want us to do? Well, have those hard conversations. It might seem like it's a small universe of the people who are around you, but that's the place to start. And if you're not the one to bring up these issues that you care about and the ones that you want our government to care more about, then you can't expect anyone else to do it. It starts with, with one ripple, and you ripple a few more people. That's how our votes work. That's how our foreign policy works. That's how our domestic policy works. So everybody has a role to play, and I just encourage you all to do your part.
So with those closing words, thank you, Elizabeth Shackelford. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We know that you're all busy. We hope that you're staying safe and that you're staying healthy. So thank you all, and we'll sign off. Elizabeth, why don't you stay on for a few more minutes, okay?
Sure.
If you can.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.